So let's begin our series now with our first speaker. Sister Helen Alford is an ordinary professor of economics and ethics and vice dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the Pontifical University of St. Thomas, the Angelicum, in Rome, Italy. She is also director of the master's program in management and corporate social responsibility. She is co-author of the book Managing as If Faith Mattered, and her research mostly looks at the role and impact of ethics and Christian thought in the field of management, particularly as regards CSR and sustainability. Her most recent book in English, edited with Francesco Compagnoni, is Preaching Justice: Dominican Contributions to Social Ethics in the 20th Century. Sister Helen is a graduate of Cambridge University, having studied engineering at the Tripos level and having received a PhD from the University of Cambridge in engineering some years ago, but after my own doctorate. So she's a younger member of our guests this year. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Sister Helen Alford.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I hope you can hear me okay. So it's a great honor to be here to open this lecture course. It's not my first time in Notre Dame, and I hope it's not my last. And I think it's a tribute to the dean and to the business school that you should have this kind of course to really learn something about important current topics. And also a tribute to them that they should have put as the first lecture in this series, a consideration of this topic, impact investing, from the point of view of the Catholic social tradition. I think it shows that Notre Dame and the Mendoza College are really trying to live up to the very exciting and important mission that Catholic universities have in societies today, offering very useful and new vistas to people in this dialogue between the Catholic social tradition and all the forms of branches of knowledge that we can think of. Now, before going into the main topic, though, I have to tell you a joke, okay? This is part of my ritual as a British person, because as you may know, if you've seen all these BBC programs that come over from the UK on PBS and this kind of thing, we're a little bit uptight, British, you see, and we like to tell things by means of jokes, usually, you know. All after dinner speeches and important and solemn occasions have to include jokes, okay? So I usually like to start with a joke because it calms everybody down and we feel better, and the rest of the lecture goes off better if we do that. And I was thinking while I was on my way here, what joke can I tell? You know? But as I arrived yesterday evening, I knew what this joke was, because as I got out of the plane, the cold hit me. As you know, I'm living in Rome, and it's just a little bit warmer right now in Rome than it is here. And it reminded me of a joke, which I was told when I was teaching in the United States 20 years ago by somebody who'd been a student in Notre Dame 20 years before that. So this goes back 40 years in the history of Notre Dame. I hope I'm saying your name properly. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing it properly. First of all, you have to have in mind, as you know better than I do, that in the central square of the university, you've got the cupola with the big statue of the Virgin Mary on top of it, and then down on the ground floor, further away, still in that central area, you've got the statue of the Sacred Heart with his hands out like this, you know? So, thinking about arriving in this cold place, I was reminded about what my friend told me, his experience when he was a student here. The one time during a very cold winter, some very enterprising young students managed to get up onto the cupola and hang around the shoulders of the statue of the Blessed Virgin Mary a great big sign with great big letters on it saying, "Jesus, it's cold up here." To which the following day, there appeared a great big sign around the arms of the Sacred Heart. It's facing and looking up at her, as you know. Another big sign saying, "Mother, I know." So that, I hope, is my little funny comment to set us up here. Of course, we're not feeling cold here, thankfully. Okay, so this is our first little problem. Oh, that one, sorry. Okay, thank you. So this is a little bit of an outline of what I would like to do with you. As you saw in the title, we've got impact investing and Catholic social thought. So it's very vague what the relationship is between them. So the first little point would just be a minute or so, and what can we expect from this relationship? And we, I think, would normally characterize it as a dialogue. Impact investing has something to offer the Catholic social tradition. The Catholic social tradition has something to offer impact investing. So what can we expect from this dialogue? What kind of thing can we expect that could come out of it? Okay, so a minute or two on that. Then a short, I hope, quick overview of impact investing. I'm sorry about the acronyms, but it helps me get things on the slide. Overview of what impact investing is, what it's doing. Many of you will already be somewhat familiar with this, but we just make sure that we share some common knowledge for the main part of the discussion, which is about the dialogue. First of all, on impact investing, and then on Catholic social thought and Catholic social teaching and the Catholic social tradition. I should say, also I meant to say that under the first point, we've got this acronym CST, which I'm sure most of you have used either to mean Catholic social teaching or to mean Catholic social thought. Here, I want to use it, well, sometimes to mean Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought, but more to mean the Catholic social tradition. That meaning also including action and activity. And that's because impact investing is an active practice, practical way of doing investing. So I want to include that in the dialogue. We'll get to that as we move through. But I will sometimes talk about Catholic social teaching, Catholic social thought. So then we'll get to our dialogue, and I want to try and argue here that there's insights that can go both ways. Catholic social tradition and Catholic social thought can get insights from impact investing, and vice versa, can offer insights to those involved in doing this work. And I would like you, if it's possible, given the fact that we're in a Catholic university here, to keep in mind some of the things that we'll say at that point for the rest of this lecture course. Because I think, obviously, we won't be able to get into a lot of the details to do with impact investing today. But if you could keep this sort of little scheme that we'll talk about today in mind and keep thinking about it as the course goes through so you can deepen this dialogue between the Catholic social tradition and impact investing. Then I'd like to just turn to some open questions. We're getting towards the end. We're getting to the discussion part. Maybe you would like to pick up on some of these questions and make a comparison with what we might call a cautionary tale. If we were here 10 years ago or 20 years ago, starting a course on, of this kind 10 years hence, we might have been talking about microfinance rather than impact investing. Microfinance has done a lot, but it's also had some problems. And why not try and learn some things from the problems that it's had? So learn something from history. And some final concluding thoughts, and we'll open up to discussion. Okay, so our first little bit on what can we expect from a dialogue between Catholic social thought and impact investing. This quote comes from the Compendium of the social doctrine, of the social teaching of the Church. I think it's a very nice way of trying to summarize quickly what we can expect or what we could hope to get from such a dialogue. As you can see, there's something about what other branches of knowledge offer to the Catholic social tradition, and then there's something about what the Catholic social tradition can offer to those other branches. The italics are in the original document. I didn't add those. So the first part, an attentive and constant openness to other branches of knowledge makes the Church's social doctrine reliable, concrete, and relevant. Okay, so that's a useful starting point for us. We want to be thinking about how looking at impact investing can help the Catholic tradition have these three qualities of being reliable, concrete, and relevant. In the other direction, then, we can say, the interdisciplinary dialogue also challenges the sciences, or knowledge in general, to grasp the perspectives of meaning, value, and commitment that the Church's social doctrine reveals. Okay, again, we have three things: meaning, value, and commitment. If we wanted to summarize what those three things are, perhaps we could say they're about the why we're doing things. Now, often in our university courses, we're mostly dealing with technical questions, how we get things done. We don't often necessarily look at why we're doing this, especially in the business school and especially in economics. You know, my friends who teach economics in various Catholic universities tell me the usual way that the first economics course starts off, Economics 101, in the first class, is with a discussion about normative and positive economics. And then the professor says, well, we're not going to look at normative questions in this course. We're going to look at the way we do things, at the positive type of economics. And then the normative questions are just not considered for the rest of the course. Now, that's where Catholic social tradition is very strong in offering the why, the normative bit, okay? So that's the value, in a way, that this can offer to the technical disciplines. Value, what the worth of doing something, and our commitment to it. How should we be committed? Okay, so I'm going to come back. I'll make some quotes from that later as we go on with the discussion. Okay, so then our first main point, the overview of these two areas. Quick history and overview. First of all, impact investing. Well, if you look at the research that's done on this, pretty much the consensus is that all forms of investing that take into account social or environmental or intrinsically important factors in an investment decision, the history of that starts with religious groups. Religious groups like the Methodists, like the Quakers, were trying to incorporate other criteria into their investment decisions centuries ago. Right? When the stock markets just start developing, when investment just starts to become an important topic, you can track it back in history. And you'll find that it's really the religiously inspired investors who are trying to do this. At the beginning, they're rather primitive and crude about what they do. Mostly they just screen out what you would have heard called, I'm sure, the sin stocks, things they didn't want to invest in. Okay? It starts off like that, but then it starts to become more sophisticated as time goes on. So impact investing has its roots in that. So our discussion today, in a way, has a long history going back. The way impact investing partly exists because there has been this dialogue between the Christian tradition and investment. More specifically, impact investing comes out of a type of investing that started to have a name in the 1970s with the name community investing, even though that too has a longer history that goes back, especially with the question of housing. Big foundations, for instance, were involved, and other kinds of actors were involved in investing in social housing projects a long time before the 1970s. But anyway, in the 1970s, we get this term that develops called community investing. And some people, like Amy Dominy, those of you who know this sphere of socially responsible business and investing will know her name. She set up a special index of companies who aim to be socially responsible. Amy Dominy is on record as saying, I don't like this term impact investing. Why do we have to use it? We've already been doing it for the last 30 or 40 years under the term community investing. So anyhow, that's not really so important, the terminology type question. But anyway, to show that there's a connection going back. It's new in a way, impact investing, but it also has a history. And then the last thing I'd say on that first point is that even today, if you go to something like the social capital conferences that take place that have thousands of people at them, as one of the speakers at a conference that the dean was at with myself in the Vatican last year said, you scratch most of the people there and very near the surface, you'll find some kind of religious motivation for having brought them there. So there's still a very strong connection between religious belief and the motivation that comes from that and forms of investment that take social and environmental objectives into account. So that's the first thing I'd like to say about impact investing. There's a connection, comes out of religious inspiration. Secondly, I would like to say it's part of a wider movement that includes things like corporate social responsibility, sustainability, blended value. There's lots of different ways of talking about this. They're all part of a movement in general, which I think we can characterize in this way, a movement from a sequential model of human development, which says, first of all, we make as much money as we can in our businesses, and then we use that money for things that we think are intrinsically important. We pay our employees who then use that money to support their families. We do some philanthropic activity. We pay taxes, and then the government sets up hospitals and schools and various things. So we're using that money to create social good in that sense. But first of all, we have to make the money. Okay, and you can see how if you have this model, people could be very resistant to trying to incorporate any kind of social or environmental or other kind of objective into the first stage, because they would say, no, we just must focus on making as much money as possible, and then we can use that money to create social good. Okay? Now, all these other movements like sustainability, like CSR, like impact investing are part of a change in that thinking towards what we could call a parallel model, where we try to achieve intrinsically valuable goals, like sustaining environmental systems, like sustaining human communities, health questions, education. We try to achieve these goals contemporaneously while making economic return. Now, from the point of view of a religious tradition, you can see by the fact that the religiously inspired investors were always trying to introduce more objectives into money making. This is a very good movement, but they've always been trying to do this. The thing that's changed in terms of our economy is that the mainstream is beginning to think like this too. And there's various factors in terms of the changes in economic life that have pushed this. Perhaps the most overwhelming one is globalization. Now you can have a situation where people will invest their money in a certain place, make a big profit, and then that money can move somewhere else in the world very, very quickly. The idea of having capital controls today is really anathema for most economists. Meanwhile, the people, who are the other input to producing that output, and of course the local environment stays where it is. People don't move that much. Despite all our big worries about migration, it's still only about 2 to 3% of the world population that migrates. Most people stay where they are. Or they might move within their own home country, but they don't go into other countries very much. So you get a problem with this model because the money has disappeared. You can't then have a second distribution to the other inputs into the production process so easily as you could before, where you had more national economies and you had less globalization, at least on a capital sense of the economy. So, and there are other factors too that are pushing this as well. So impact investing is part of that, okay? Just so we're giving context here. This is our first lecture, so it's a good idea to do this. Another way of looking at impact investing is to say that it's part of a spectrum. Here we've got a spectrum that comes from a US foundation, the F.B. Heron Foundation. They talk about the mission-related investment continuum. And basically what you're looking at here is moving from, on the one end, you're using your money to create social good by giving it away. So that's a grant-based, not really investment in the classical sense, but you're using your money to create social good through a charity, through a non-profit, through an NGO. You just give your money, okay? Then we have the other side of the spectrum. You're investing in companies or in businesses of various kinds, and you want a market-based return from that. Okay, so you can invest in different ways, and you can create different amounts of social good using those investments. And the impact investing idea is that it's somewhere in the middle. At least this is the F.B. Heron idea, and we can also see that in the next slide, which comes from a very important report that came out last September. If you're interested in this question, you should have a look at it, from a G8 commissioned task force on social impact investing. Again, you can see here, they've got the same idea of a continuum. You've got on the top part of the diagram the investors. They have money to invest, and they can use this money along this continuum, starting on your right-hand side with using it in a philanthropic way, just giving money to create the chance for people to go to school or to improve health outcomes or these kinds of questions, through to investing in all kinds of businesses. They still say investing sustainably, so businesses who are trying to adopt some kind of social responsible agenda, because of course here they're talking about forms of investing that take social factors into account. So there's various ways of doing it. But the thing that's interesting from their point of view are what they call the impact-driven organizations in the middle. And you probably can't read it very well, but you can see the structure. They've got impact-driven organizations, and they've got some that are more on the business side, and there are some that are more on the civil society or non-profit side. Okay? And these organizations are producing a combination of social value and economic value. Now, let's just say a little bit more about those organizations. This typology comes from a book that was written about social enterprise. Some of the ways in which you could think about those organizations in the middle, just to give you a sense of what we're talking about. On the more non-profit side, these two writers, Elkington and Harkington, talk about a kind of non-profit which can grow very fast. They call it the leveraged non-profit venture. Okay? It's not a sort of classical non-profit in the sense that it grows fast and it uses a very business-type model in the way it runs itself, even though it's not actually making any money. It's the kind of organizations, they said, that produces public goods where governments are not willing or able to do so, so especially in poor countries where the state is very weak, and where the private sector cannot justify the risk in relation to the rewards. But these organizations are not just classical non-profits, because as I say, they scale. If you look at the last 40 years, then in the United States, the numbers of businesses that have been able to scale from startup to 50 million turnover is tens of thousands. The number of non-profits that managed to do that over the same time period is, I think, about 142. So it's much harder for non-profits to scale up and produce an impact in terms of scale. But these leveraged non-profit ventures are different in that sense. In that sense, they're in this middle category. The Barefoot College is a good example. It's in India. It's founded by a young man who had the best possible education you could get in India, but who realized that poor people were actually very enterprising, and all they needed was a structure to help them use their skills, develop them more, and they could do a lot for each other, for themselves. So the Barefoot College he set up, which is poor people educating and training and working together with each other to produce extraordinary social outcomes. When I talk about educating each other, they're doing things like training each other to be solar engineers and producing systems of solar powering in extremely harsh conditions where the average solar engineer from big companies that are producing these systems now would say it's not non-economic. We can't produce an effective functioning system there. These poor people, because they know their local environment really well, because they're really motivated to work together, they manage to do it. So it's a college that's also producing social good in terms of, for instance, energy systems for poor villages as well. It needs still grant funding. It can't raise enough income to support itself economically. But it's one of these impact organizations in this middle group that we're talking about. Then another one is a hybrid, what they call a hybrid non-profit venture. And here we've got an example from United States, Rubicon programs. Rubicon started off as a training organization for people who had great difficulty entering the labor market, people who had a history of drug dependence or had been homeless, violence, prison records, all these kinds of very difficult situations. Rubicon was trying to give them skills and to get them back into the marketplace. At a certain point, Rubicon decided it would be much better if we founded our own businesses alongside our training program. We can train people and also give them business experience and then move them into the mainstream market from that. So Rubicon became what they call here a hybrid non-profit venture. It still needs some grant funding. It can't cover all its costs for the training that it needs to give these people because they need a lot of support from the income it's making from its businesses, but a significant proportion is covered from the businesses. They're in bakery, they're in landscape, all this kind of thing. So you've got a mixture there of grant and profit. And then the final model is the social business venture. This is a kind of organization which is set up to create social good and is actually able to support itself economically by doing that. The picture there you have comes from the last name mentioned there, La Fajeda. It's a dairy industry, a dairy company in Catalonia, in northern Spain, where it works. It has a bigger market share than Danone, so it's a very successful business. And it was founded by a psychiatric nurse who was working with psychiatric patients in the hospital and was horrified by the pointlessness of the tasks that these people were given. And he says in the book, psychiatric people are ill, they have illnesses, but they are not stupid, and they know when they are being treated as idiots. And we could do something with these people, and we could make a really functioning business with them. And so he set up this dairy business. It's run by the psychiatric patients, and it's very successful, and it doesn't need grant funding. It's a full-blown business in that sense. But it's a social business because its main job is to provide this employment for these people with psychiatric illnesses. So you can see there's various types of organization in this middle between what you might call full market investment and grant philanthropy on the other end. Okay. One other quick point on that. Another reason why impact investing is being driven is the needs, the size of the needs that have to be dealt with. Rockefeller Foundation, which is credited with coming up with this term in 2007 of impact investing. If you look at this video with some of their people in it, a conference that took place a few months ago, they talk about why they realized they had to start mobilizing resources from beyond philanthropy and even government. You can see some statistics here. They were thinking about their 100th anniversary coming up, which was in 2013. They were thinking about what they had achieved and what the new challenges were going to be for the kind of work that they were doing. And they just realized that the resources that they have in terms of principles in US Foundation, 600 billion, these are the figures they give in the video, 600 billion invested, distribution of 45 billion per year. The needs are so enormous now. They mentioned this figure of 2.2 to 3 trillion for social housing. I'm not sure, I think they were talking about globally for that number. But you can see the figures show that we don't have anything like the resources that are needed in the non-profit sector, at least, to deal with really confronting these social problems. Hence, we need to find new sources of income. And that was what drove them to get involved in impact investing. Now, this is a last sort of different figure who thinks about impact investing in a very different way. And I just wanted to make sure he was on your radar screen. Paul Polak is his name. He was at the conference last May that your dean and myself were at on impact investing. And his big concern is, what are we going to do about the very poorest people in the world? He set up 40 years ago now a non-profit, and from the beginning he said this non-profit has to serve at least 1 million people. In fact, by the time he handed it on to others to manage it, it was serving 20 million people. So he was interested in the scaling problem from the beginning. This particular non-profit was providing water to agricultural workers in Bangladesh during the dry season and increasing very much their possibility to produce during the year, during the dry season. Now he's handed over that non-profit to other people, and he's now founded 4 multinationals. Each one has to reach at least 100 million people, he says. One is dealing with clean water, another one with education, and then 2 with energy. One solar energy and another one on biomass. And his idea is that impact investing in serving these poor people, is going to be the best possible way of investing your money. We're going to get the biggest possible returns. So he doesn't think of impact investing as in a sort of spectrum between full market return investment and grant philanthropy, where you get no return on your investment. He thinks of impact investment as the best possible financial as well as social investment. And he says during this video, you can watch this is his talk that he gave in the conference last May. I don't believe that you have to subsidize returns. I believe this represents a huge virgin market opportunity with much higher risk than normal, and returns should be commensurate with the risk. Okay, we're just getting to the end now of this discussion about impact investment, and then we'll say something about Catholic social thought and the Catholic social tradition. This is a few little images from the G8 report. It's quite interesting because it's mostly oriented towards governments, this report. Okay, we haven't talked much about governments in impact investing up to now, but they have a very crucial role in creating an environment that can help this form of investing go forward. And this is the definition that they give, which I haven't mentioned a definition up to now, so I wanted to put that up there. They talk about social impact investments as those that intentionally target specific social objectives, along with a financial return, and measure the achievement of both. Okay, so this will be the 3 important characteristics. So target a social objective with a financial return and measure the achievement of both. And just to conclude on that report, 3 main points that come out of it. They talk about this idea of a 3rd dimension, that in the future, when people are making investment decisions, they're going to be considering 3 factors. They're going to have 3 dimensions to their decision, not just risk and return, but also impact. What's the impact that this investment is having? That's going to be part of their investment decision. Secondly, if that is the case, if the first case is going to be so, we need mechanisms to protect the mission of a business. Okay? You know, you could think about examples, I don't know, the Ben and Jerry's of this world or other companies. They start off with a particular way of trying to do business, and then the management changes or the shareholding changes, or there are other changes that take place, and this mission gets lost. Okay? And the business loses its combination of economic and social objectives that it had at the beginning, at its foundation. What they're saying is we have to create legal structures which will prevent that from happening. In fact, you already have something like this in the United States, and they talk about this in the B Corporation model. But in general, what we need is what they call a mission lock for businesses that pursue, as they say, profit with purpose. Now, this will be quite interesting for the discussion with Catholic social thought in a moment, because in a way, in the Catholic social tradition, we'll find a form that's been encouraged within the Christian tradition that already has this mission lock in it. We'll talk about that later. And then the 3rd thing is the importance of measuring impact. Okay, if you go to any conference now, I can guarantee you that other lectures in this series that talk about impact investing, one of the key things they're going to be talking about is how you measure it. Okay, how do you measure impact? Very, very difficult, very, very important problem, and I would say a bit more complex in terms of the underlying principles for management than often people admit. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about that too as we go on. So now we're going to switch to the other side of the dialogue, to the Catholic social tradition. I'm hoping that you, as students from Notre Dame, already know quite a lot about Catholic social thought. So this is really going to be a little bit of a summary. We mentioned these three acronyms at the beginning. I wanted to just give you a little graphic to give you this sense that we have social teaching in the middle, then this expands out to a wider group of thinkers, Catholic social thought, that's the CSE2, and then we have the biggest group of all, which is the movement as a whole, or the tradition as a whole, which is including all kinds of people actively trying to live out this tradition. So we're talking about schools, we're talking about hospitals, we're talking about youth groups, women's groups, all kinds of little organizations, associations, or even large, that are trying to carry forward this way of bringing the gospel into social life through their activities. And if we wanted to summarize in one sentence, what is the Catholic social tradition? I hope that this sentence here would get most of it. A tradition of, first of all, philosophical and theological reflection, both things. Okay? Also, spirituality, meaning a life of faith, prayer, in community with other believers, and of action. Okay, so those three things, and then set always with this dialogue with the rest of the world, in dialogue with others, trying to learn from others as we go on. Okay, underlying basis of Catholic social thought. Perhaps we don't often talk about this, and that's why I put this in here. Underlying basis in terms of the philosophical starting point. Okay. Catholic social thought definitely starts from a kind of creation perspective. God as creator has given the gift of creation to the world, has brought things into being, okay? And that we are here because of this basic gift of having being, okay? And that this creation is good. Now, from this, we can get that first line, being is good, which in fact is an idea which isn't unique to the Christians. There's lots of other philosophical traditions that hold to this. But I think it's easier to understand why we can say being is good if we have this creation theology behind it. So being is good. What does this mean here? It means that the good thing is to help that what has been created, the being that has been created, especially the human being, but not only the human being. We're talking about all created beings in that sense, to bring out the fullness of their existence. That's the measure of good, turning what is potential in those beings into reality. That's the crucial idea. Especially if you think about human beings, we all know that there's all kinds of potentiality that we have, and through education, and through acting, and through all kinds of, basically various kinds of acting, we can turn what is a potential within our being into a reality. We can learn a foreign language, we can gain a skill, we can play a musical instrument, we can learn how to use a piece of software, all these kinds of things. And we choose what we do with that potentiality. So our freedom is exercised in that sense. Okay? So where the freedom comes in, we have to think about our judgment as well. We'll say something about that in a moment. But the basic starting point is that what is good is the thing that brings into fuller realization what is created in our world, okay? Especially human beings. And from that follows this practical principle, do good and avoid evil. Okay, now I hope you can see, and you've probably talked about this in business ethics courses, that this approach relates to some of the other ethical theories that are around in the business ethics world. For instance, it relates a bit to rule keeping, or to deontology, or to Kantian approach. Rule keeping is useful. It can especially help us avoid doing things which are bad, like the Ten Commandments, or the negative human rights a person has a right not to have this done to them, or not another thing, or not to be tortured, and so on. So rules can help us. They can help us in more ways than just that. But they're not the fundamental thing about being good, okay? They help us in trying to find what is the truly good way of developing human beings, creating value in that sense. Similarly, the consequences of our actions are part of our consideration about what is good, but it depends how they relate to creating this fullness of being in human life. So they're important, but they're not the whole story. And if we go down the road of deontology or consequentialism, and we only take these as our measures of what is good, we start to distort our picture, and we end up going off track. So they need to be part of this bigger vision of creating something which is truly good in terms of creating realizing something that's potential in being. That's the starting point for Catholic social thought, philosophically. Okay, then the common good comes after that, human dignity, all these other things that you know a lot about. Immediately, however, we have to say, okay, you could say, well, I might say, drinking myself into a drunken oblivion is what I want to do, and I think that's good for me. Okay, so here we have a question to consider. How do we form good judgments about what's good? An important thinker in the tradition, St. Thomas, I'm sure you've heard about him, would say that all human beings try to do something they think is good for them. The trouble is that they make mistakes when they decide about that. They go for what we can call an apparent good, not a true good, not a real good. People can get worried about this because they start to think there's a sort of authoritarian agenda here, behind this. Much more, it's about trying to help people realize what is their true potential. We know that people can make bad decisions about their lives and end up doing things which they felt was truly their free decision and asserting their right to make decisions, but which end up damaging themselves, and other people can see it, and that can happen in the case of businesses as well. So much of the problem with environmental degradation comes from poor decisions made by businesses who thought they were doing something good, but in fact, overall, taking a bigger picture, they were doing something that was damaging. So it's not easy to decide, especially in business, what is a true good and what is an apparent good. Because we're thinking about innovations. We're thinking about creating value in the future. We've got lots of stakeholders. We've got lots of different points of view to take into account. It's tough to ask this question and to try to come up with a good question, a good answer. But we have to try to do it. That's the point. We can't just stick our heads in the sand and say, normative questions are out, and we're just going to look at how we do this, whatever we want to do as well as possible, okay? And now there's more and more consideration about this. Stakeholder engagements are one way of taking other people's views into account. Forms of standards that we have, voluntary standards, that's another way of helping us see these things. Also consulting wisdom traditions, getting good advice from wise people, reading the Bible, praying, all these sorts of things are inputs into making good decisions, okay? So I want to emphasize this point because it's very important following on from the previous one. Okay, so then we get to this slide, which has probably got a lot of words on it, which I hope you've seen before, mostly, because most of these words I'm not going to talk about, okay? But in a way, I would like it to be a sort of a scheme for you thinking about the content of the rest of the lectures in the rest of this course. If we're going to think about impact investing in relation to the Catholic social tradition, we can only open up the topic today. The rest of the lectures, you'll hear from people who are really technically expert in this area, and it'll be a chance for you to carry on this dialogue between impact investing and Catholic social tradition. And I think this chart, if you could keep it in mind, could help you do that. Because we're trying to systematize here a lot of things that you hear about or read about in Catholic social thought. And we've got two basic starting points. We've got, if you like, the micro starting point with the human being and the idea of human dignity. Okay? Going up through the fact that human beings, through their activity, form themselves. They develop their characters, which is the idea of virtues. I'm sure that you've looked at this in your philosophy courses. And then we can spread out in our diagram across the various virtues that are usually talked about. Then coming down from the generality, from the community as a whole, we talk about the common good. We use this term a lot. I'll say something more about that in a moment. And in a way, these principles of Catholic social thought are like the kind of structure, they're like the kind of skeleton which structures our good as a community as a whole. And we need to see these two starting points coming together and meeting. And in this case, they're coming together and meeting in our evaluation of impact investing. So I can't go into all these different principles, and I don't think I need to, because I think you would have done things about this in your courses on Catholic social thought. But I want to say something, first of all, about human dignity, and then something in the next slide about the common good. Human dignity, where does it come from? Where does this idea come from? Well, we can talk about where it comes from historically, which is quite interesting. But in terms of maybe ontological or philosophical starting point, we could say it comes from the fact that we are a transcendent being. You know, we have a purpose and a value which goes beyond our physical life here on Earth, which has a spiritual dimension. Now, we're used to thinking about human beings as having mind and body, or spirit and matter, and having two dimensions. But in this discussion, it's very, very useful to think about those two dimensions a slightly different way, as our individuality, because we're each individuated by a body, and as our relationality, as being intrinsically relational beings through our spiritual life. Now, what does that mean? Well, we know from our life each day that as individuated beings, as physical beings, we need certain things. We need food, we need shelter, we need money to acquire these things. We're needy beings, okay? It tends to put us in competition with other people for those kinds of goods. So we experience relationships of competition. And we have individual objectives that we have to achieve in order to sustain ourselves. And how do we achieve them? Well, usually with other people, but our relationships with them for doing that are on the model of what we could call a contractual relationship. You know, I work with you, you work with me, I gain what I need, you gain what you need, and that's the end of our contract. You know, it's an instrument, it's a useful thing which we establish between us to help each of us achieve our own objectives. Okay? Now we experience that. That's the way of thinking about the human being in most economic theories. Okay? The thing is that we also have this other dimension, which in fact much modern psychological, genetic, neuroscience research is showing that there's traces of it even in our physical makeup. We have this other dimension, which is what we can call intrinsically relational. You know, all the research on happiness, on what makes people happy, shows that we are happy because of the deep relationships that we have with other people. You know, and those are the things that we really value. The way in which we can grow together in communion with other people. Now, I could give you other examples as well, but we're running out of time. This is just to show you that we don't only relate to other people in this contractual way. We also relate to them as beings who are relate to them in a way where we share objectives with them. We're not just trying to achieve individual objectives, we're trying to achieve an objective that we're sharing between us. We'll say more about that in a minute when we look at the common good slide, okay? But what I want to say here, the reason why I mentioned this here, is that the common good isn't just some idea that kind of drops out of heaven, but it's connected with who we are as human beings. It comes out of this spiritual, relational side, okay? So when we look at the common good, we can see that, as we have written here, when two or more people collaborate towards achieving a common objective, like friends, trying to build their relationship with each other, they create a good between them, a common shared good which they hold between them. And it only exists between them. It doesn't make sense to say, this bit is yours and this bit is mine. A friendship only has value because it's between two people, because it's shared. That's its value, in the sharing, okay? And that's going on all the time in our relationships. We are building intrinsically important goods, shared goods with other people in business as we work with them. So for instance, when we work together towards a common shared goal, we create a common good. And in fact, you see this in literature about businesses, in the idea, for instance, of core competencies, which was developed in the 1980s, dealing with Japanese companies, arguing that they had a competence for miniaturization. They could take whatever electronic product you had and they could miniaturize it. This was a property not of the individual members of that company, but of the company as a whole. It was a good that they shared in common. And if you broke up Panasonic or Technics or any of these big Japanese companies and sent all the engineers and people who worked in them to work elsewhere, they would bring with them their individual skill, but the core competence of the business as a whole would be lost. We would lose something that was held between them. So the common good is this kind of good. And the common good, a society as a whole, is built up from all these relational goods that are gradually starting off in families, in local communities, in businesses, in churches, in non-profits, this very rich, articulated creation of good on all these different levels that gradually works its way up to society as a whole. That's the common good in that sense. Okay, so we talked about ideas. I also want to mention, because we're talking about the Catholic social tradition, some practical examples from the history of Catholic social tradition that are close to the impact investing area. Just one word on medieval forms, guilds, and these precedents to modern banks, which were called the Montes Pietatis. You can look them up if you don't know anything about them yet. As these two important researchers, economists say, the purpose of these groups, guilds, were obviously groups organized around particular types of work. You had the Shoemakers Guild and the Candlemakers Guild and all these different guilds. The Montes Pietatis were a kind of credit union in modern terms. The purpose was to prevent the ruin of the less productive or non-self-sufficient social groups. That was why they were founded, these organizations. Now, in modern times, the most important form is the cooperative, okay? Cooperatives are formed by people coming together. They form a shared organization together. They all put some money into it, but usually not that much. And so we can call it as a society of persons rather than a society of capital. Okay, the cooperative is formed of the people rather than of the investments that the investors are making in the shares. Okay, and we have again a lot of connection between the founding of these cooperative movements and the Christian tradition. The big credit movement cooperatives formed in Germany by a Protestant mayor in the middle of the 1800s. The farmers' cooperatives, which are very important in Denmark. Were inspired by Lutheran bishop, and then probably one of the biggest cooperative systems in the world in Mondragon in northern Spain, if you're interested in this, you can look it up, was founded by a priest in the 1950s. Now, all of these cooperatives, and this is one of the ways in which they link with impact investing, were founded in situations of dire want and poverty. Okay, these poor people bound together to form a little credit union, or to form a way of selling their agricultural product, or to form a way of being able to buy the goods they needed, you know. And that was the way in which these cooperatives got going. Nowadays, if you look at the data from the International Cooperative Alliance, there's nearly 1 billion members in cooperatives. They employ about 250 million people. They have the biggest 300 cooperatives in the world have a combined turnover of $2.2 trillion. That's only the biggest ones. In the US, the cooperatives are also very big. I wouldn't be surprised if some of you here today haven't had something to do with cooperatives. Over a third of the population is involved in a cooperative, 120 million people. 30,000 co-ops, 2 million jobs. So the definition that the ICA gives to a cooperative today is an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. So you can see here in the DNA of the organization, remember we were talking about mission lock for impact investing, that businesses should be able to put their purpose into their legal founding. The cooperative has a kind of a mission lock in it. It has by its very nature a social goal. And you can see some principles here, which I don't have time to talk about. I think we should move on. Anyway, you can see these slides afterwards. But the other thing that's very interesting about them is the democratic control. You know, some people would say that cooperatives represent a further stage on from modern corporations, where you have political democracy, but you have hierarchical control in businesses. And the cooperatives represent a further development of democracy into the economic sphere. So they're a sort of a next stage beyond modern corporations, just as democracy was a stage on beyond hierarchical systems of politics before. Anyway, we can talk about this. Okay, so some thoughts about how they could be in dialogue. I hope that you can enrich these thoughts as the course goes on. So, what can impact investing offer to Catholic social thought? And thinking right back to the beginning of our talk, we said, in dialogue with the other branches of knowledge, Catholic social thought can become more reliable, concrete, and relevant. Okay? So I think at least three things. First thing is that impact investing can challenge the church to think about the potentially crucial role of profit-making business and hence of private investment in confronting poverty. I'm not sure that the Christian tradition has really taken that seriously enough. The way I would put it is, if you think about the types of institutions that we're used to thinking about in the Catholic Church, you know, we have Catholic schools, Catholic hospitals, Catholic youth clubs, Catholic NGOs, Catholic charities. Do we have Catholic businesses? Now, we're not used to this idea that you could have Catholic business. And I think it's partly to do with this lack of realization of the potentially important role of profit-making business in dealing with the kinds of social problems which the church has always wanted to deal with, but mostly through charity, through NGOs, through education, that kind of. So this is, I think, the challenge of impact investing to Catholic social thought, to take this more seriously, this possibility more seriously, to be discerning about it, of course, not just to roll over and say this is wonderful and not make any critique, but to really think about this more seriously. Then also, I think social entrepreneurship as a possible model for church institutions confronting poverty. You know, we're used to using more charity-based structures, and everybody says we still need charity. Nobody's saying impact investing should get rid of charity. Okay? There's always going to be a role for charity, but that we could, alongside the charities, also create these other kinds of intermediate organizations that we were looking at before, you know, like the La Fajeda, like the Rubicon programs, like the Barefoot College, you know, these kinds of intermediate organizations. And then also there's the question of investment. I got the nice seal of Notre Dame. I wanted to get something about Notre Dame in the pictures somewhere along the way. You know, obviously there's a huge endowment here that's being invested. It's a possible question for Notre Dame trustees to think about how they could invest their capital, their principal, directly in dealing with social, creating social value in a way that also creates a financial return for the university. Here you can see a little structure that's so beloved of business people, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. This is a an attempt on my part to start mapping what could we say are the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats for the Catholic social tradition in the light of a discussion with impact investing. Well, I think clearly its strengths include the strong emphasis on the dignity of the human person and the common good, and putting those at the center of any initiative to solve social problems. That's a real strength of the Catholic social tradition. It can provide criteria for good that are relatively resistant to capture by business, meaning that they could be just used as kind of a marketing ploy, as a sort of fig leaf to cover over the old way of doing business. Because you have the Catholic Church behind this tradition, the principles are also relatively resistant to capture in that way. So they can also provide a critique. They can be at a critical distance to business and can help keep it on track, keep it following what it should be following and not shifting, as we will see when we look at microfinance, towards just pure money making. Okay? But keep the balance between the social good and the economic good. Weaknesses we already mentioned a bit. We're not necessarily so good within the Catholic social tradition of taking the technical and practical issues seriously enough. And we don't necessarily coordinate well enough with other actors to produce positive social outcomes. Maybe less of a problem in the US, more of a problem in other parts of the world. I think opportunities for the church are really great here. You know, we're coming out of the last 250 years where the church has been in a sort of defensive position. It's being on the margins of society. The innovative thinkers, the leading thinkers were, if not actively against the church, were regarded as something irrelevant, something not to be. I think with these kinds of changes in the economic sphere, we could see, if we could really handle very well this dialogue between Catholic social thought and impact activists, the church could move really to a much more leading position, could be part of the innovators in society in this sphere. So I think it's quite a big opportunity for the church if we can really develop a good dialogue. Business increasingly recognizes its need for partnership with civil society and government and with faith-based organizations. So there's opportunities there. There's also threats. There's reputational risk. We'll see some of this when we look at microfinance in a moment. Risk of capture, risk of a naive relationship with business. You know, we need to keep that critical edge. We need some people who are going to be saying, this is a load of rubbish. You know, we shouldn't be involved with business. We need people who are sort of like the sort of Jeremiah figures, who keep on asking questions like that. We don't want to lose that critical edge, okay? But at the same time, we want to be part of what is good, carrying the gospel, carrying the mission of the church out into the economic sphere. Okay, what does the Catholic tradition offer to impact investing? Well, in some respects, we've already mentioned some of these points. These basic values of human dignity and the common good, a long history with the connection of the roots of impact investing, which could help to keep it on track in the sense of keeping this third dimension in the investment decision, risk, return, and impact. And it's an example of the cooperative movement. You know, it's very easy for business to collapse down back to just becoming purely money-making. We see that a lot happening. And then I think we've got a question here about scalability. You know, when you try to scale up options, you're trying to serve poor people on a mass scale, you could start to lose some of the real benefits of what we're seeing in impact investing now. Those examples that I gave you, apart from Barefoot College, are generally small examples. They're based on close relationships with people. If we have a really strong combination of solidarity and subsidiarity in a serious way, and these ideas are there for the taking in the Catholic social tradition, we can help create an approach to scaling which keeps the focus on the poor customer and the importance of relationships with that person. Here you can see two pictures of Paul Polak talking to poor customers. For him, this is the crucial starting point. You must listen to poor people and let them tell you what they need, and then you start to work with them. Well, if you've got, as he says, a multinational he wants to found, serving 100 million people, trying to keep that closeness to listening to poor people is actually very difficult. and a principle of subsidiarity really worked into the organizational structures of these organizations could help. So what's the equivalent SWOT analysis for impact investing in the light of the dialogue with Catholic social thought? Well, I think the strengths of impact investing, as we've already mentioned in various ways, is it uses the primary mechanisms we know for poverty alleviation, entrepreneurship, and markets. Okay, people getting up and doing something, and then the market mechanism to help them share what they've done with others and create efficient use of resources. Also, because there's this idea that we can get a return from doing this, we can attract many different investors and entrepreneurs into solving social problems. It's really very strong strengths there. Weaknesses, though, are also present, and we don't want to forget these. Ends can become means. That happens all the time in businesses. Human dignity is used and manipulated for the sake of making more money. And we're not just talking about sweatshops and people being treated badly in poor countries, but much of what's done in marketing is playing on people's weaknesses, not trying to sell them a really good product, trying to help them see what they could get access to products that could really help them have a better life, but trying to manipulate their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities. An end has become a means. To serve the human person is no longer the goal. It's using the person to make more money. This happens very, very easily in business. It can happen here too. It doesn't have an integrated vision of the good, impact investing. There's a lot of vagueness about what it means to do social good. Okay? And need for personal commitment and virtue can be obscured by system design. We didn't say too much about that. But often what you find with people who are in business is they tend to focus on, especially when you look at change management, for instance. Change management systems are all about top-down. What are the top guys going to do? What the leader's going to do? What's the rollout of the program? All this kind of thing. It tends to not take very seriously that people need to change, that the characters need to change if organizations are going to change. What are the opportunities for impact investing in the light of this dialogue with Catholic social thought? Well, many social problems remain unsolved, and many poor people still need products and services that could be supplied with a profit. So we agree about that. Partnership with local government and or civil society to create integrated solutions is another important positive opportunity, and the G8 Taskforce report was very strong on that. Threats. Social and environmental good becomes obscured by financial gain. That can always happen as we try to expand to mainstream investors who haven't got the same motivation that the initial investors had. Okay? Businesses can also disrupt local social systems and may not be able to resolve such problems. In microfinance, we saw that in a very sad situation that occurred in 2010 in Andhra Pradesh in India. What these very well-meaning and good microfinance guys didn't realize was that the political leaders were going to start using what they were doing for the sake of their political campaigns. And this created a really unresolvable problem for them, which led to suicides of some of their borrowers, and that it created a lot of disruption, a lot of negativity in that area, because they hadn't really thought about how to deal with the disruption that their disruption in a positive sense, disruptive technologies do a lot that's good, not just bad, what it was going to affect their work was going to have on the social system. Okay, some open questions. And maybe I should leave these, but anyway, strengths and weaknesses in the idea of impact, I think we can jump that one. Timescales. Social good often takes longer to create than economic good. Scalability, we already talked about. And then the question of weakness, breakdown, failure. I put this in because I recently heard a talk by Jean Vanier, who some of you will know, the founder of L'Arche. It's a very important organization that works with handicapped people. And Jean Vanier's whole sort of thrust is that we have to just stop thinking about being efficient and being effective, and that we have to listen to people who are handicapped. We have to let them give something to us. it's a sort of contemplative model, okay? All I'm asking in a way is, this is very get up and go, very let's change the world, the impact investing, and yet we need this contemplative side if we are going to have a complete human approach to problems, social problems. I think I should stop, don't you think? We've got...
How about questions?
Yeah, exactly. That will be fine. Thanks.
All right. We have microphones that will come around, and just put up your hand. We'll see that one gets to.
Yes.
One here.
Oh, one's right there. Oh.
Thank you very much, Sister, for really an excellent talk. As you know, I teach in this area, but you put it together in a marvelous way.
Thank you.
My second thought would be, as you know, I work with the United Nations Global Compact, where we have 8,000 companies in 135 countries doing projects of social impact. One of the problems that I try to address with these companies is they tend, under social impact, to only want to take on projects that in fact can return a profit. And what I like to point out is some of the best companies take on projects knowing they're not going to return a profit, like Merck giving HIV/AIDS drugs away, or river blindness cures for free. But they get reputational capital. So it's factored in the long run, but it's not the short run. That to me is a danger in looking simply at social impact, because they tend to take the short term. And as you probably know, Michael Porter has a similar idea with creating shared value.
Right.
And I've debated Michael on this issue, that he forgets about reputational capital and how that can be very important for a business.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, I take your point. I think it's a very, very valuable point. Yes, thanks.
Other questions? Sister, I have one.
Okay.
How do you stimulate interest in this? How do you get people to pay attention? The thing I hear from people who work in capital markets is that this is the province of do-gooders. And clearly you're out doing good, so she's got it. I'm not interested. How do you get others interested in exploring this?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question, because, you know, one of the ways of doing it is exactly what Father Oliver was talking about, that you show people they can gain something from doing it, even within their existing mindset. You know, so they can gain some reputational capital, or they can gain some financial return, or something of this. I think that would always be a first phase, you know. Often people will only do something that later on they realize is actually valuable in its own right, if at the beginning they can see there's some benefit for them. You have to get them moving, as you were saying, get people interested in it. But if it only stays at that level, then we haven't really achieved very much. And as soon as we hit a problem where it isn't obvious what the return is, we will very likely to lose their interest. So it has to be, if you like, a first stage of conversion, if you like. That's one of the slides that we didn't look at the end. We need to have a sense, I think, as a church, as a Christian social tradition, that we have to help people in the economic sphere really become, yes, I would use that word, converted to a different way of thinking about economics. Economics which is supporting in parallel. Remember we talked at the beginning, not just make as much money and then use the money up, but is actually in the very process of making money, supporting the creation of social and environmental value. And we have to also learn better how to do that. how to be convincing about that. Perhaps as a religious community, we need to have more examples of doing that ourselves. As we said, we don't really have this concept of Catholic business. Why? Well, we can think of reasons why. We do have cooperatives. They are a kind of a Catholic business, but they're not much on the radar screen of the big investors that you're talking about there. In some ways, I think we have to start where they are. Otherwise, we don't get anywhere. But if we don't push them beyond that, we haven't really achieved our goal. We've become captured by the existing system. We have to move beyond that to a conversion. It's not an easy thing to do, but if it were easy, everybody would be doing it. We have to take the challenge.
Well, as you know, the tagline we've been using for some years here is ask more business. And that's precisely what you've done. Sister Helen Alford,